You really think you caught something our inspection team missed, old man? The question cracked across the cavernous parachute loft, drawing a ripple of laughter from the cluster of Navy SEALs gathered near the packing tables. The building smelled faintly of canvas, machine oil, and the cool recycled air humming through industrial vents overhead. Rows of parachutes stretched beneath bright fluorescent lights, each one meticulously arranged for the next training cycle. At the far end of the room, seated alone at a battered steel table, Ethan Cross didn't answer. At 82 years old, he had long ago learned that silence unsettled certain people more than words ever could. His weathered hands continued their work, folding a section of white canopy fabric with slow precision. Every movement was deliberate. Every crease aligned perfectly. Across from him stood Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mercer, 31 years old, decorated, respected, and entirely convinced he was the smartest man in the room. He folded his arms and shook his head. That's what I thought. A few younger operators smirked. One nudged another with his elbow. To them, Ethan was simply the civilian contractor who packed reserve parachutes. The quiet old man with faded denim work shirts and silver hair who showed up before sunrise and left without speaking to anyone. Most of them had never bothered learning his name. Mercer turned toward the others. We've got 3 inspections, 2 electronic checks, and a full diagnostic review on every chute in this batch. But apparently Grandpa over there found something we missed. More laughter followed. Ethan remained focused on the canopy stretched before him. Then, without looking up, he placed 2 fingers on a narrow section of reinforced stitching. That one shouldn't fly. The laughter stopped. Not completely. Just enough for the room to notice the change. Mercer stared at him. Excuse me. Ethan's pale blue eyes lifted from the fabric. Calm. Steady. Unimpressed. That one shouldn't fly. Mercer glanced toward the parachute in question. It belonged to a Halo rig scheduled for a jump later that week. One of the newest systems in the inventory. Inspected. Less than 2 hours earlier. And why is that? Mercer asked. Ethan looked at the stitching again. The load distribution isn't right. A younger operator frowned. Another rolled his eyes. Mercer barked a short laugh. The load distribution. He repeated the words as if tasting something ridiculous. You figured that out from across the room? Ethan returned his attention to his work. No, the answer was simple. I figured it out when I packed it. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the room erupted again. This time louder. A few operators exchanged amused glances. Mercer shook his head in disbelief. That's incredible. He paced toward the chute and lifted part of the harness. You know how many engineers worked on this system? Ethan said nothing. Mercer continued anyway. People with advanced degrees. Aerospace specialists. Design teams. Test evaluators. He dropped the harness back onto the table. But somehow you spotted a problem they all missed. Ethan folded another section of fabric. Outside the large warehouse windows, the afternoon sun cast long bars of gold across the polished concrete floor. Dust drifted through the light like tiny suspended stars. The old veteran's expression never changed. Around him, the noise continued. The jokes. The confidence. The certainty. Yet beneath it all, Ethan felt something else. Something familiar. The same uneasy feeling that had followed him through decades of quiet observation. He looked once more toward the parachute. The stitching was nearly perfect. Nearly. Just enough to fool a machine. Just enough to fool an inspector. But not enough to fool him. Across the loft, Mercer waved dismissively and turned away. The operators followed. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. The moment seemed over. Yet as Ethan reached forward to straighten a loose fold of canvas, the collar of his faded work shirt shifted slightly against his neck. Hidden beneath the fabric, unseen by everyone in the room, a faded black symbol rested against weathered skin. A mark older than most of the men inside the building. A mark almost nobody alive would recognize. And before the day was over, one man would see it and everything inside that loft would change. The afternoon settled over the parachute loft with the slow weight of gathering heat. Outside, beyond the chain-link fences and neatly painted hangars, a transport aircraft rolled across the runway, its engines producing a distant rumble that vibrated faintly through the steel framework of the building. Inside, the operators had moved on. At least they appeared to. The conversations were louder now, but every few minutes someone glanced toward Ethan Cross. It was difficult not to. The old man seemed completely untouched by the ridicule. Most people reacted when challenged. They became defensive. They argued. They tried to prove themselves. Ethan did none of those things. He simply worked. The steady rustle of nylon followed him from table to table as he inspected another parachute. His fingers moved slowly across the material, feeling things that could not be measured by scanners or software. Small imperfections, tiny inconsistencies, details invisible to most people. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mercer watched from across the room while pretending not to. Something about the old man irritated him. Perhaps it was the confidence. Not loud confidence. Not arrogant confidence. The kind that existed without needing anyone else's approval. Mercer had spent his entire adult life surrounded by competition. Every achievement had to be earned, measured, documented, and displayed. Yet Ethan Cross carried himself like someone who no longer needed validation from anyone. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. A younger operator named Tyler Brooks approached the inspection table and lifted the parachute Ethan had flagged earlier. "You really think there is something wrong with this one?" he asked. Ethan glanced up briefly. "I know there is." Tyler examined the stitching. "Looks fine to me." "It should," Ethan replied. "That is why nobody saw it." Tyler frowned. He was about to ask another question when Mercer stepped forward. "Do not encourage this." The younger operator immediately straightened. Mercer placed both hands on the table. "We have standards here." Ethan nodded once. "That is good." The response only made Mercer more annoyed. "You know what your problem is?" Mercer asked. Ethan continued folding fabric. "No, you think experience automatically makes you right." Several operators nearby grew quiet. Ethan looked at him for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. His pale eyes remained calm. "Experience does not make anyone right." Mercer crossed his arms. "Then what does?" Ethan returned to his work. Paying attention. The answer landed harder than Mercer expected. A few operators exchanged glances. Tyler quickly looked away. For a brief moment, nobody laughed. Nobody made a joke. The room seemed suspended between irritation and uncertainty. Then a radio crackled somewhere near the equipment lockers, breaking the tension. Activity resumed. Conversations returned. Yet the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Not because Ethan had won an argument. He had barely spoken. It was because none of them could explain why his certainty felt different. An hour later, sunlight streamed through the western windows, turning sections of the loft amber and gold. Ethan carried a folded canopy toward a storage rack near the rear wall. As he lifted the heavy bundle onto the shelf, the collar of his shirt slipped lower against his neck. Only for a second. Just enough. Across the room, Tyler Brooks happened to look up at that exact moment. His eyes narrowed. Something dark was visible near the base of Ethan's neck. Not a modern tattoo. Not decorative. The lines appeared old. Faded by decades. Tyler stared for another second before Ethan adjusted his collar, and the mark disappeared beneath the fabric. The young operator blinked. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. He did not know why. He had seen tattoos his entire career. Thousands of them. Yet something about that symbol felt familiar. Not familiar because he had seen it recently. Familiar because he had seen it somewhere important. Somewhere he could not quite remember. As Ethan walked quietly toward the next packing table, Tyler continued watching him. The memory sat just beyond reach, like a distant light hidden behind heavy fog. And for the first time all day, someone other than Ethan was paying attention. Tyler Brooks tried to ignore it. For nearly 20 minutes he focused on inventory reports, inspection logs, and equipment manifests stacked across a workstation near the center of the loft. But every time he lowered his eyes to the paperwork, the faded symbol resurfaced in his mind. There had been something unusual about it. Not the tattoo itself. Operators collected tattoos the way pilots collected flight patches. It was the design, the shape, the feeling it stirred. Somewhere, years earlier, he had seen it before. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the flight line beyond the warehouse windows. The distant whine of jet engines drifted through the air as another aircraft climbed into the clear North Carolina sky. Around him, the loft remained busy. Operators prepared gear. Technicians reviewed schedules. Conversations blended into a constant low hum beneath the fluorescent lights. Yet Tyler's attention kept returning to Ethan Cross. The old man worked alone at the far end of the building. Quiet. Methodical. completely indifferent to the attention he had attracted. Finally, Tyler stood and walked toward the equipment archive room. It was a small office tucked behind the main loft, filled with filing cabinets, old photographs, retired manuals, and shelves containing decades of training materials. Most people avoided it unless they needed something specific. Tyler stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room smelled faintly of paper, dust, and aging binders. He sat at a computer terminal and opened a database containing historical unit records and archive training presentations. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for, only that the memory felt connected to something military, something old. After several minutes, he found himself opening a presentation from an advanced leadership seminar he had attended 3 years earlier. The course had covered special operations history, unconventional warfare, and several declassified programs that influenced modern doctrine. Tyler scrolled through slide after slide. Unit insignias, historic photographs, operational concepts. Most of it looked familiar. None of it matched. Then he stopped. His pulse quickened slightly. On a grainy black and white image near the end of the presentation, partially visible on the collar of an operator standing near an aircraft, was a symbol that looked remarkably similar to the one he had seen on Ethan's neck. The photograph was old. Very old. The caption beneath it was frustratingly vague. It referenced a specialized parachute evaluation group attached to a classified advisory program during the late 1960s. Most of the details remained redacted even in the training materials. Tyler leaned closer to the screen. The image quality was poor. The tattoo was barely visible. Yet the resemblance was unmistakable. A cold uneasiness settled over him. He glanced back toward the loft through the small office window. Ethan continued working, unaware of the attention now focused on him. Tyler looked again at the photograph. The operators in the image appeared young, confident, and impossibly distant from the modern world. Yet one detail caught his attention immediately. The parachute system visible in the photograph looked strikingly similar to the emergency deployment procedures still taught to naval special warfare candidates today. Tyler sat back slowly. That did not make sense. The techniques were supposed to have evolved over decades. Yet here they were in a photograph older than his father. He stared at the screen for another moment before reaching for his phone. His thumb hovered above the camera application. He hesitated. Then he stood and walked back into the loft. Across the room, Ethan cross-bent over another canopy. The collar of his faded work shirt shifted slightly as he worked. Tyler raised his phone and discreetly captured a single image. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at the old man. Something deep in his instincts told him this was no ordinary tattoo. And somewhere else on the base, a commander was about to receive a message that would turn an ordinary afternoon into something nobody in the loft would ever forget. Commander Nathan Briggs was halfway through a planning meeting when his phone vibrated against the conference table. The room overlooked the western side of the base, where the late afternoon sun reflected off hangars and parked aircraft in bands of orange light. Around him, officers discussed schedules, weather forecasts, and training windows for the coming week. Normally, Briggs ignored messages during briefings. This one caught his attention because it came from Tyler Brooks. Tyler was not the type to send unnecessary communications. Briggs glanced at the screen. Attached was a photograph and a short message. "Sir, does this symbol mean anything to you?" Briggs opened the image. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the color drained from his face. The conversation around the table continued without him. Weather patterns, altitude restrictions, aircraft availability. The words faded into background noise. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. The symbol was faded. Time had worn away portions of the ink. Yet the shape remained unmistakable. Briggs slowly sat back in his chair. Across the table, a lieutenant commander noticed the change immediately. "Sir." Briggs did not answer. He enlarged the image. Every line, every angle, every detail matched a photograph he had seen years earlier during an advanced command course. Not because it was famous. Quite the opposite. Very few people had ever seen it. Most operators never even heard the name associated with it. The symbol belonged to a parachute evaluation and field development group that officially no longer existed. A unit whose contributions survived inside training manuals while the men themselves disappeared into history. Briggs remembered standing inside a secure classroom nearly a decade earlier. An instructor had projected an aging photograph onto a screen. 5 operators stood beside stacks of parachutes near an airstrip somewhere overseas. No names were provided. Only a simple statement. Modern naval special warfare airborne procedures owe more to these men than most people will ever know. Briggs stared at the image on his phone. The same symbol appeared on the neck of one operator standing near the center. The instructor had spent less than 60 seconds discussing it before moving on. Most students forgot the slide immediately. Briggs never did. Something about the story stayed with him. The men had tested equipment nobody trusted, evaluated systems nobody wanted to use, solved problems nobody else could solve. Yet their names rarely appeared in official histories. "Commander," another officer asked. Briggs blinked and returned to the present. Every eye in the room was now on him. Without explanation, he stood. "Continue without me." The officers exchanged confused glances. Briggs was already moving toward the door. "Sir, is everything all right?" someone asked. Briggs paused briefly. His gaze shifted toward the photograph one final time. "I am about to find out." Minutes later, he was crossing the base in a utility vehicle. The road stretched between training facilities and administrative buildings, bathed in golden evening light. Wind rushed through the open side window. His thoughts traveled much farther than the few miles between headquarters and the parachute loft. He remembered another detail from that long-ago classroom. A final remark made by the instructor before ending the lesson. "If you ever meet one of them, listen carefully. They notice things nobody else sees." Briggs tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Back inside the loft, Ethan Cross continued working exactly as he had all day. Calm, unhurried, unaware that a commander was now racing across the installation because of a faded mark hidden beneath a collar. And as the sun dropped lower toward the horizon, the distance between the old veteran and the truth he had quietly carried for decades was rapidly disappearing. The parachute loft had grown quieter as evening approached. The loud confidence that had filled the building earlier was slowly being replaced by the fatigue of a long training day. Operators completed checklists. Equipment cases snapped shut. The last rays of sunlight stretched through the high windows, painting the concrete floor in bands of amber and gold. Ethan Cross sat alone at a packing table near the rear wall, inspecting a reserve canopy beneath a bright overhead lamp. The world around him seemed distant. His hands moved with the same deliberate precision they had carried for decades. Every fold aligned, every strap, settled exactly where it belonged. Across the room, Tyler Brooks watched him with growing curiosity. The message had been sent nearly 20 minutes earlier. Since then, he had received no response. That worried him more than if Commander Briggs had dismissed the photo entirely. Silence from certain people often meant they were thinking, and commanders rarely stopped what they were doing unless something mattered. Ryan Mercer noticed Tyler glancing repeatedly toward the entrance. "Waiting for someone?" he asked. Tyler hesitated. "Not exactly." Mercer smirked. "Still chasing that tattoo mystery?" A few nearby operators laughed. Tyler forced a small smile, but said nothing. The laughter faded quickly. For reasons none of them could fully explain, joking about the old man no longer felt quite as funny as it had earlier. Perhaps it was the confidence with which he had identified the flaw in the parachute. Perhaps it was the strange reaction the symbol had triggered. Whatever the reason, the atmosphere had changed. Mercer walked toward Ethan's workstation. "Tell me something," he said. Ethan looked up calmly. "What?" Mercer rested one hand on the table. "How long have you been packing parachutes?" Ethan considered the question. "A long time." "That is not an answer." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "It is the correct answer." Several operators exchanged amused looks. Mercer shook his head. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Answer questions without actually answering them." Ethan returned his attention to the canopy. "Sometimes the question is not the important part." Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The old man was already working again. It was like arguing with the wind. There was nothing to push against, nothing to provoke, no reaction to exploit. Before Mercer could continue, a memory unexpectedly surfaced inside Ethan's mind. The sound of nylon sliding across the table triggered it. For a brief moment, the modern loft faded away. He remembered another room. Smaller, hotter. The year had been different. The parachutes had been different. The men around him had been young, nervous, determined. He remembered spending an entire night modifying equipment because standard procedures were not enough. He remembered watching test jumpers place absolute trust in work nobody outside their group would ever understand. Most of all, He remembered the lesson an old instructor had taught him. Machines follow instructions. Men survive because somebody notices what the machine misses. The memory drifted away as quietly as it had arrived. Ethan blinked and found himself back beneath the fluorescent lights. Across the room, a vehicle door slammed outside. The sound echoed faintly through the building. Tyler turned immediately toward the entrance. So did several others. Moments later, the main door opened. Cool evening air swept into the loft. Every conversation slowed. Every movement seemed to hesitate. Commander Nathan Briggs stepped inside. He was still wearing the same uniform from headquarters. His expression was unreadable. The operators straightened instinctively. Nobody had expected a commander to appear unannounced at this hour. Briggs did not acknowledge anyone. Not Mercer. Not Tyler. Not the technicians. His eyes moved across the room with quiet purpose until they found the old man seated beneath the lamp. Then he stopped walking. For the first time all evening, the commander looked genuinely unsettled. And in that instant, everyone in the loft understood that whatever was about to happen had nothing to do with an ordinary civilian contractor. The loft had become so quiet that the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Commander Nathan Briggs stood just inside the entrance, his gaze fixed on Ethan Cross. Around him, operators exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody understood why a senior commander had arrived without warning. More importantly, nobody understood why he appeared less interested in the facility than in the elderly civilian sitting at the far end of the room. Ethan noticed him immediately. He looked up from the parachute spread across his table and met the commander's eyes. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence carried a strange weight. Not tension, recognition. Briggs began walking across the floor. His boots echoed softly against the concrete. Operators stepped aside without being asked. Tyler Brooks watched with growing anticipation. Ryan Mercer folded his arms and frowned. The commander passed directly by him without acknowledgement. That alone was unusual. When Briggs finally stopped, he stood beside Ethan's workstation and looked down at the partially packed canopy. "You still fold them the same way," he said quietly. Ethan glanced at him. "It still works." Briggs nodded once. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Apparently it does." The exchange confused everyone listening. Mercer shifted uneasily. Tyler looked from one man to the other. The commander was speaking to Ethan as though they had met before. Yet Briggs was barely in his 40s. Ethan was more than 80. The timeline made no sense. Briggs studied him for another moment. Then his eyes moved toward the old man's collar. "May I ask you something?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "You already drove all the way over here. Might as well." A few operators exchanged surprised glances. Nobody spoke to commanders that way. Briggs seemed completely unbothered. "The symbol on your neck." The room instantly became still. Tyler felt his stomach tighten. Mercer looked toward Ethan's collar. Several operators leaned forward slightly. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. "What about it?" Briggs hesitated. For the first time since entering the building, uncertainty appeared on his face. "I need to know if I am seeing what I think I am seeing." Ethan regarded him calmly. Then he reached up and loosened the top button of his work shirt. The faded symbol became visible beneath the collar. Time had softened the ink. Decades had blurred portions of the design. Yet the shape remained clear enough. Briggs stared at it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, almost reverently, the commander exhaled. "I knew it." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mercer looked completely lost now. Tyler watched Briggs carefully. The commander's reaction carried none of the excitement people displayed when meeting celebrities or heroes. It looked more like respect. Deep respect. The kind that came from understanding something others did not. Briggs glanced toward the operators gathered nearby. "Do any of you know what that symbol is?" Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. Briggs nodded. "I did not think so." His gaze returned to Ethan. "I was told there were not many left." Ethan shrugged. Time tends to solve that problem. A few nervous laughs appeared and disappeared almost immediately. Briggs did not smile. Instead, he looked around the loft at the parachutes, the inspection stations, the equipment racks, and the operators standing quietly under the fluorescent lights. Then he said something that made every person in the room freeze. "The emergency deployment procedures all of you train on every year." He paused. "The ones your instructors teach. The ones your manuals reference. The ones you trust with your lives." Briggs looked directly at Ethan Cross. They exist because of men who wore that symbol. The words settled across the room like falling concrete. Nobody laughed now. Nobody even shifted their weight. Ryan Mercer's confidence vanished completely. Tyler Brooks felt a chill run through him despite the warm air inside the building. And for the first time all day, every operator in the loft looked at Ethan Cross not as an old contractor, but as a man whose story had barely begun to reveal itself. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Commander Briggs finished. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across the loft, reflecting off polished buckles, neatly folded canopies, and rows of equipment that suddenly seemed connected to a history none of the operators had ever considered. Ryan Mercer stared at Ethan Cross as though seeing him for the first time. The old man looked exactly the same as he had an hour earlier. The same faded work shirt, the same calm expression, the same weathered hands resting on a parachute packing table. Yet everything felt different now. Briggs slowly pulled a nearby chair away from a workstation and sat down facing Ethan. It was an action so unexpected that several operators exchanged stunned looks. Commanders did not usually sit down in the middle of a work floor to speak with civilian contractors. "I read about your group," Briggs said quietly. "Only fragments. Most of it was missing." Ethan gave a faint nod. "Most of it was supposed to be." Briggs smiled slightly. "The instructor called you pioneers." Ethan looked toward the rows of parachutes hanging along the far wall. "That was not the word we used." A few operators allowed themselves cautious smiles. The tension had shifted, not disappeared. Shifted. The atmosphere no longer felt confrontational. It felt historic. Tyler Brooks stepped closer. "Sir," he said carefully, looking at Briggs, "was it really that important?" Briggs turned toward him. "You trust these systems every time you leave an aircraft?" Tyler nodded. "Then yes," Briggs replied. "It was that important." He looked back at Ethan. "The records said your team spent years testing deployment methods nobody believed would work." Ethan shrugged. "Some worked. Some did not." "And the procedures?" Briggs asked. "The emergency recovery sequence." Ethan glanced down at the canopy on the table. Somebody had to figure it out. The simplicity of the answer seemed almost absurd. Mercer frowned. "That is it?" he asked before he could stop himself. Every eye shifted toward him. Mercer hesitated but continued. "You were talking about methods used across naval special warfare. Training standards. Safety protocols. And he says somebody had to figure it out?" Ethan finally looked directly at him. His expression carried no irritation, no triumph, only quiet patience. Most things that matter start because somebody notices a problem. Mercer remembered the parachute Ethan had flagged earlier, the one everyone had dismissed. A feeling of discomfort settled in his chest. Briggs noticed it. "Did he tell you a chute had an issue?" Mercer nodded reluctantly. "Earlier today." "And?" Briggs asked. "We disagreed." Ethan returned to his work before Mercer could answer further. The old veteran seemed completely uninterested in defending himself. That fact somehow made the situation more uncomfortable. Briggs studied the parachute lying nearby. "Has anyone checked it again?" Silence followed. Mercer looked toward the inspection table. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Tyler spoke. "No, sir." Briggs stood. "Then maybe we should." The suggestion carried no accusation. Yet everyone in the room understood its meaning. Operators began moving toward the inspection station. Technicians followed. Within moments, several people were reviewing the parachute Ethan had identified hours earlier. The loft filled with quiet activity. Checklists appeared. Measurements were taken. Stitching was examined. Ethan remained seated. He did not watch. He did not offer advice. He simply folded another section of nylon beneath the lamp. Across the room, Commander Briggs observed him carefully. There was a reason legends survived. It was not because they talked about what they had done. It was because decades later, the results were still quietly speaking for them. And as technicians continued examining the parachute, a growing realization spread through the loft. Everyone was no longer wondering who Ethan Cross had been. They were beginning to understand who he still was. The inspection station became the center of the entire loft. Operators who had been preparing to leave for the evening now stood shoulder to shoulder around the long steel table. The golden light outside had faded into deep blue twilight, and the fluorescent fixtures overhead cast sharp reflections across the parachute hardware. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was making jokes. Every eye remained fixed on the canopy Ethan Cross had identified hours earlier. A senior rigger carefully spread the material across the table while two technicians reviewed the inspection log beside him. Commander Briggs stood nearby with his arms folded. Ryan Mercer remained silent at the edge of the group. The confidence that had defined him all afternoon had disappeared. In its place was something far less comfortable. Uncertainty. One technician examined the stitching pattern through a magnifying lens. Another compared measurements against factory specifications. Minutes passed. The only sounds were turning pages, rustling nylon, and the occasional click of a flashlight. Then the senior rigger stopped moving. His brow furrowed. He leaned closer. Hold on. The room immediately grew still. A second technician moved beside him. What is it? The rigger traced a section of reinforced stitching with one finger. This alignment. He looked up. It is off. Nobody reacted at first. The words seemed too simple, too small. Then the second technician examined the same section. His expression changed instantly. How did we miss that? Another specialist stepped forward. He checked the measurements independently. The result was identical. A manufacturing variance. Tiny, nearly invisible, yet positioned in a way that could alter load distribution during deployment. Not enough to trigger software warnings. Not enough to fail automated diagnostics. Just enough to matter. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Tyler Brooks slowly exhaled. Commander Briggs said nothing. He did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Across the room, Ethan remained seated beneath the lamp, continuing his work as though nothing unusual had happened. He did not look toward the inspection station. He did not seek acknowledgement. He simply folded another section of canopy fabric with steady hands. Mercer stared at him. The realization settled slowly but completely. The old man had seen what an entire team of trained professionals had missed. Not because he possessed better technology. Not because he had access to hidden information. He had seen it because decades of experience had taught him where to look. Briggs finally broke the silence. Remove it from service. The senior rigger nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Mercer swallowed hard. He crossed the floor and stopped beside Ethan's table. For a moment, he struggled to find the words. Ethan continued working. Mr. Cross. Ethan glanced up. Mercer shifted awkwardly. Every operator in the room could see how difficult this was for him. You were right. Ethan looked at him for a second. Then he nodded once. Good. Mercer almost laughed at the simplicity of the response. There was no satisfaction in Ethan's voice. No victory. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Just quiet acceptance. The commander watched the exchange carefully. Then he stepped forward. There is something else they should know. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Briggs looked around the loft. The procedures your team still use today were not merely influenced by his group. He paused. Many of them were written from recommendations he personally submitted after years of field testing. Several operators stared in disbelief. Tyler felt his heart sink. The manuals, the training blocks, the safety lessons, they had all studied them for years. Yet none of them had recognized the man who helped build them. Ethan sighed softly and returned to folding the canopy. That was a long time ago. Briggs shook his head. Not to the people still benefiting from it. And for the second time that evening, complete silence settled over the loft as everyone finally understood the true scale of the man they had almost dismissed. The last of the paperwork was finished nearly an hour later. The defective parachute had been tagged, documented, and removed from circulation. Most of the operators remained in the loft despite the late hour. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Outside, darkness had settled across the base. The windows reflected the interior lights like mirrors, turning the building into an island of brightness surrounded by the quiet North Carolina night. Ethan Cross finished folding the canopy in front of him and carefully secured the final strap. His hands paused for a moment on the fabric. The familiar texture brought 1,000 memories with it. Aircraft engines humming in distant darkness. Long hours spent solving problems nobody else could see. Young men trusting equipment because somebody had taken the time to get it right. Through all those years, one lesson had remained unchanged. Details mattered. Commander Briggs stood near the center of the room, speaking quietly with the senior riggers. When he finished, he walked back toward Ethan's workstation. The operators instinctively made room. Nobody had been told to. They simply did. Briggs stopped beside the table and looked down at the neatly packed parachute. Still perfect, he said. Ethan smiled faintly. Perfect is expensive. I settle for reliable. A few operators laughed softly. This time the laughter carried respect rather than mockery. Briggs nodded. Reliable has kept a lot of people safe. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Briggs reached into his pocket and removed a small challenge coin bearing the insignia of his command. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no speech, no ceremony. He simply placed it carefully on the table beside Ethan's hand. The room became silent again. Everyone understood what they were witnessing. Ethan looked at the coin. Then he looked at Briggs. I already work here. Briggs smiled. I know. Ethan studied the coin for a moment before placing his hand over it. Not accepting it with pride. Not refusing it out of humility. Simply acknowledging the respect behind it. Ryan Mercer stepped forward. The movement drew every eye in the room. He stopped beside the table and stood awkwardly for a second. Finding words had never been difficult for him before. Tonight was different. Mr. Cross, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Ethan looked up. Mercer took a breath. I thought I knew what I was looking at. Ethan nodded. Most people do. A few operators lowered their eyes. The words were not harsh. If anything, they sounded understanding. Mercer shook his head. I was wrong. Ethan considered him for a moment. Then he smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of someone proven right. The smile of someone who had lived long enough to understand mistakes. That happens too. The tension dissolved instantly. Several operators smiled. Tyler Brooks let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Across the loft, the atmosphere finally relaxed. The commander looked around the room. He saw younger operators studying the old veteran with new appreciation. He saw technicians examining equipment more carefully than before. He saw a lesson that no classroom presentation could have taught. Ethan stood slowly and gathered his tools. A worn measuring tape, a small notebook, a pair of reading glasses. Ordinary objects carried in an ordinary canvas bag. Nothing about him looked legendary. Nothing except the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of competence. As he turned toward the exit, the operators naturally stepped aside. Not because rank required it. Not because protocol demanded it. Because respect had finally arrived. Ethan paused near the door and glanced back one last time. The loft was exactly as he had found it that morning. The same lights. The same parachutes. The same people. Yet somehow everything felt different. Then he walked out into the cool night air and disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot. No dramatic farewell followed. No applause. Only silence. The kind of silence that remains after people discover that the most extraordinary individuals are often the ones who never feel the need to tell you who they are. Some symbols fade with time. The men who earn them never do.